Nobody in that classroom expected what was about to happen. It started like any other day. Students settled into their seats, notebooks open, waiting for the lecture to begin. But there was an energy in the air, something unspoken yet heavy. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a regular discussion. Then the professor spoke. His words were sharp, calculated, meant to cut. He wasn't just questioning Karoline Leavitt, he was challenging her, mocking her, daring her to crumble under pressure. The class watched, some smirking, others uneasy, waiting for her to fumble. But instead of backing down, she did something no one saw coming. She didn't just respond. She flipped the entire conversation on its head. And in that single moment, a debate turned into something much bigger. A moment that would spread beyond those four walls and shake up everything. The university hall buzzed with restless energy. Seats were filled, students leaned forward, some whispering, others just waiting. Everyone knew debates with this professor weren't just discussions, they were performances. And he always made sure he was the star. Dr. Richard Lawson had built his reputation over decades. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a force in the academic world. His debates weren't about exchanging ideas, they were about winning. He had a habit of crushing students who dared to challenge him, picking apart their words with ease. Today, his attention was on Karoline Leavitt. She wasn't just another student. She had real-world experience in politics, a sharp mind, and a reputation for holding her ground. But in his eyes, she was young, inexperienced, and out of her depth. The students in the room had different expectations. Some were eager to watch him tear her apart, confident that he would do what he always did: dissect her arguments, humiliate her, and walk away victorious. Others weren't so sure. They had seen her before. They knew she wasn't easily rattled. Dr. Lawson leaned back in his chair, scanning the audience with his usual smirk. He thrived in moments like this: public takedowns, controlled conversations, making sure his opponents never had the upper hand. Karoline, on the other hand, sat upright. She didn't shift, didn't fidget. Her expression gave nothing away. She had been in high-pressure rooms before. She had faced cameras, critics, and seasoned politicians. A university professor wasn't going to shake her. The air in the room grew heavier as the moderator cleared his throat. The stage was set. The debate was about to begin. And everyone expected Dr. Lawson to dominate, except he had no idea what was coming. Dr. Lawson adjusted his microphone, his usual smirk in place. The room settled as he leaned forward, setting the tone for what was about to unfold. This generation, he began, scanning the crowd, has an interesting way of defining credibility. We used to respect experience, education, and critical thinking. But now, popularity seems to be enough. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Some students exchanged knowing glances. Others stayed quiet, sensing where this was going. He continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It's fascinating how some people manage to build entire careers by repeating what their followers want to hear. No real expertise, no independent thought. Just prepackaged slogans dressed up as opinions. The meaning wasn't lost on anyone. He wasn't addressing the class, he was taking aim at Karoline. Still, she didn't move. No reaction. Lawson leaned back, as if thinking out loud. It makes you wonder, what actually qualifies someone to speak on national issues? Their age? Their political connections? Or maybe, just maybe, their ability to parrot the right talking points? This time, the laughter was louder. A few students glanced in Karoline's direction, waiting for her to respond. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing the attack was personal. Still, she didn't react. Lawson's smile widened. He had played this game before. Set the trap, watched the opponent stumble, then finish them off. He turned fully toward her now, his voice casual but pointed. Miss Leavitt, help me understand. Do you truly believe you're here because of your knowledge, your expertise? Or did you simply say the right things to the right people and ride the wave? The room went silent. The tension thickened. Some students smirked, expecting her to struggle. Others lowered their gazes, sensing the weight of the moment. Karoline finally leaned forward, resting her hands together. For the first time since the debate started, she spoke. Her voice was calm, steady. "Are you asking me a question, Professor? Or are you just setting up your punchline?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Dr. Lawson's smirk twitched, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, I'm just giving context. But sure, let's hear what you have to say." Karoline exhaled, her expression unreadable. She wasn't going to raise her voice. She wasn't going to let emotion dictate her response. But she was about to do something that would change the entire debate. A quiet tension filled the room. Karoline's words had landed, but she wasn't finished. She clasped her hands together, tilting her head slightly. Her voice remained steady, unshaken. "I find it interesting," she said, "how those who claim to champion young voices suddenly change their tune when those voices don't match their own." A murmur spread through the audience. Some students exchanged glances. Others sat up a little straighter, sensing the shift. Dr. Lawson chuckled, though there was no real humor in it. "Come on now," he said, shaking his head. "This isn't about silencing anyone. It's about credibility. It's about whether people are actually thinking for themselves or just playing a role." Karoline nodded as if she understood. "I agree," she said smoothly. "So let's talk about that." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. "You've been a professor for over 2 decades. You stand at this podium day after day, teaching students the importance of independent thought, of questioning authority, of speaking up. But now, when someone does exactly that from a perspective you don't like, it's suddenly not critical thinking anymore. It's blind loyalty." A few students in the back whispered. Someone let out a quiet "hmm." Dr. Lawson shifted in his chair. "That's not what I'm saying," he replied, his tone less certain than before. "Isn't it?" Karoline shot back, still calm. "You didn't challenge my argument. You didn't ask me to defend my position. You didn't even debate policy. You just slapped a label on me and expected that to be enough." A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Some students who had chuckled minutes ago were now nodding along. Others leaned in, their interest growing. Lawson opened his mouth, then hesitated. Karoline took the opportunity to press further. "The truth is, this isn't about me. It never was. It's about control. It's about people like you being perfectly fine with young women speaking up, as long as they say the right things." This time, the response was louder. A few students exchanged knowing looks. Someone near the front smirked, shaking their head. Dr. Lawson let out a dry chuckle, but it lacked the confidence from before. "This is exactly what I mean," he said, waving a hand. "You take a simple critique and twist it into some grand persecution narrative." Karoline didn't blink. "Right? Because nothing says intellectual discourse like calling someone a puppet in front of an entire class." More murmurs. This time, the professor wasn't in control of the room. The moment hung in the air like a challenge. And for the first time that evening, Dr. Lawson didn't have a quick response. Dr. Lawson let out a short laugh, but it didn't carry the same authority as before. "Let's not be dramatic," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "You're taking this far too personally." His tone was lighter now, almost patronizing. It was his way of steering the conversation back to familiar ground, where he held the upper hand. But the students weren't laughing with him this time. Karoline didn't react to his attempt to downplay the moment. Instead, she met his gaze, her expression steady. "So, let me get this straight," she said. "If I push back, I'm being dramatic. But when you reduce my entire stance to an insult, that's just an observation." A murmur swept through the room. Dr. Lawson shifted in his seat, adjusting his microphone. "I'm simply questioning whether certain figures in politics are genuinely thinking for themselves," he countered, trying to regain control. "That's not an insult. That's a fair critique." Karoline nodded slowly, as if considering his words. Then, she asked, "And if a conservative professor called a liberal student a puppet for repeating left-wing ideas, would that also be considered fair critique?" The room went silent. A student in the back crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "She's got a point," he said. Another voice, A girl in the front row hesitated before speaking. Yeah. If this were the other way around, people would be furious. Dr. Lawson's fingers tapped against the desk, a subtle sign of impatience. He wasn't used to being questioned by the very students who normally looked to him for guidance. Look, he said, clearing his throat, this isn't about sides. It's about understanding the difference between genuine discourse and political theatrics. Karoline tilted her head slightly. I agree, she said, and that's why I was hoping we'd have an actual discussion. Instead, you decided to dismiss me before I even spoke. A few more students nodded. The energy in the room had shifted. The usual power dynamic had cracked, and everyone could feel it. Dr. Lawson exhaled sharply. You're free to disagree with me, Miss Leavitt, he said, forcing a smile. No one is stopping you. She smiled back, unfazed. Of course, but disagreement should come with real arguments, not cheap labels. For the first time in his career, Dr. Lawson found himself in unfamiliar territory. He wasn't leading the discussion anymore. He was losing control of it. By the next morning, the moment had spread far beyond the classroom. A student had captured the entire exchange, and within hours it was everywhere. Shared, reposted, dissected. The headline was sharp and direct. Professor tries to humiliate Karoline Leavitt. Gets destroyed instead. First, Dr. Lawson dismissed it. Viral clips came and went, and outrage never lasted long. But this was different. The views kept climbing. The comments poured in. And suddenly, it wasn't just a university debate, it was a national conversation. Social media exploded. Conservative voices seized on it immediately. Classic example of bias in academia. One commentator wrote, "This professor never wanted a debate. He wanted to control the narrative." Others praised Karoline for staying calm under pressure while exposing the hypocrisy of those who claim to support open discussion, but only when they agree with the argument. But it wasn't just conservatives reacting. Even students who didn't share her politics admitted something felt off. One post read, "I don't even like her views," but the professor didn't argue. He just insulted her. Another added, "If this had happened to a progressive student, people would be calling for his resignation." Professors across the country began weighing in. Some defended Lawson, saying he was simply challenging a student's perspective. But others weren't so sure. One educator tweeted, "Disagreeing is one thing. Dismissing someone without engaging their ideas is another." Meanwhile, Karoline stayed quiet. She didn't need to respond. The clip spoke for itself. And the more people watched, the clearer it became. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about power, bias, and who gets to decide which voices matter. Dr. Lawson, for the first time in his career, found himself at the center of a controversy he couldn't control. And the fallout was only beginning. The morning after the debate, Dr. Lawson walked into his office expecting another normal day. It wasn't. His inbox was overflowing. Some messages were from colleagues, others from students, but most were from people he didn't even know. Some were supportive, telling him to ignore the overreaction. But many were different, blunt, critical, and direct. "You completely dismissed a student instead of debating her. Why didn't you challenge her argument instead of attacking her? This is exactly why people don't trust the education system anymore." The clip had spread too far, too fast. Faculty members who usually agreed with him were suddenly distant. No one outright condemned him, but they weren't rushing to defend him either. He wasn't just a professor caught in a debate anymore. He was the face of a bigger issue. Then came the email from the university. Polite, formal message from the administration. A reminder about professionalism. A request for a conversation. He scoffed. He had seen plenty of heated debates before, this wasn't new. But this time, it wasn't just his version of events that mattered. The internet had seen everything. Back in the classroom, things had changed too. Some students who used to admire him now avoided eye contact. Others, emboldened by what happened, started asking sharper questions. Not out of respect, but to test him. One student raised a hand. "Professor, do you think dismissing an argument is the same as winning a debate?" A few quiet chuckles followed. Dr. Lawson's grip tightened on his lecture notes. The authority he had always commanded felt weaker now. His reputation wasn't just about his knowledge anymore. It was about how he had handled that moment. And for the first time, he wasn't sure how to recover. The debate was over, but for Karoline, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. While news outlets and social media argued over what had happened, she remained silent. No victory speeches, no celebratory posts. Instead, she stepped back and let the moment breathe. But behind the scenes, her phone was buzzing. Messages from journalists, invitations from political figures, requests for interviews. Some wanted to turn her into a symbol, others into a talking point. She ignored most of them. Then came an email that caught her attention. A well-known think tank invited her to speak about free speech on college campuses. Not a debate, not a performance, just an open discussion on why so many students feel silenced. At first, she hesitated. She had never set out to be anyone's spokesperson. But then she remembered the students who had approached her after the debate. The ones who said, "I don't even agree with you, but you handled that with class." This wasn't about one political side. It was about something more important. She accepted the invitation. The event was supposed to be small, but word spread fast. By the time she arrived, the auditorium was packed. Students, professors, even local reporters. Everyone wanted to hear what she had to say. She stood on stage, no script in hand, and spoke from experience. "This isn't about winning or losing debates," she began. "It's about whether we actually believe in open discussions or if we only support speech when we agree with it." She didn't attack Dr. Lawson. She didn't play the victim. Instead, she focused on what real debate should look like. Not personal attacks, not labels, but actual ideas. She ended with a simple challenge. If we want real discussions, we have to stop silencing people we don't like. That goes for both sides. When she finished, the applause was loud. Not just from conservatives, but from students of all viewpoints who wanted honest conversations, not scripted arguments. That night, Karoline made a decision. She launched a new initiative, a platform for students across the country to engage in open, respectful debate without fear of being shut down. It wasn't about pushing an agenda. It was about giving students, left, right, and independent, a space to speak freely without being dismissed. Started small. Then it grew. Universities that once ignored conservative students had to take them seriously. Discussions that were once avoided were now happening in public. And students who had stayed quiet out of fear finally had a voice. Karoline hadn't just responded to the professor that night. She had started something bigger, and people were listening. Dr. Lawson sat in the dimly lit office, staring at the email on his screen. "Meeting with administration urgent." He knew what was coming. The university had tried to ride out the controversy, hoping the outrage would die down. But it hadn't. The pressure kept building. Faculty members distanced themselves, donors raised concerns, and students began questioning his authority in the classroom. When he walked into the meeting, the mood was cold. The dean folded her hands on the desk and spoke plainly. "We need you to make a public statement clarifying your remarks." Lawson scoffed. "You want me to apologize?" A long pause. "We're asking you to consider how this affects the institution." His jaw tightened. He refused. Days later, he received another email. His courses had been reassigned for the next semester. No official firing. No dramatic exit. Just erased from the schedule. His final lecture was bitter. "Enjoy your echo chambers," he said, scanning the room. Some students clapped. Others shook their heads. When he walked out, no one stopped him. His career wasn't over, but his influence was. This wasn't just another classroom debate. It was a turning point. Dr. Lawson thought he could shut down an opposing view with a dismissive remark. But instead, he exposed something much bigger, the way intellectual spaces sometimes silence voices they don't like. Karoline didn't just defend herself that night. She changed the conversation. She proved that real debate isn't about who holds the microphone. It's about who is willing to listen. The lesson here isn't about politics. It's about how we treat different opinions. Many claim to support open discussions, but when faced with someone who challenges their beliefs, do they engage or do they dismiss? Karoline walked away from that debate with more than just a viral moment. She started something real. She reminded people that free thought matters no matter which side you're on. So now, the question isn't what happened to Dr. Lawson. The real question is, when it's your turn to speak up, will you?